have we gotten to a point of, and it sounds like we have, of no return, especially with regards to political Islamism?
Well, I wouldn't say a point of no return. I would say what we are witnessing, particularly in the aftermath of October 7th, though it's been a long time coming, is the rise of sectarianism in our politics. And by that, what I mean is the organization of politics around openly ethnic, religious lines. And we've seen this in the rise of people like George Galloway, who have specifically targeted British Muslim voters. We've seen it in the rise of now Green Party councillors at the local level who are, celebrating their election by screaming Allahu Akbar and
Ali.
Yeah, exactly, and so on. And we also see it in the surveys. I mean, we've had recent surveys that suggest 40% of British Muslims would like a Muslim-only political party. And we see it in very high levels of segregation in large parts of non-London England. People like Ed Hussein have talked about this quite openly. I was quite influenced by his book Among the Mosques, where he turned up unannounced and made the point that in many parts of England, particularly outside of the big cities, although in some areas of London too, if you are a young British Muslim, you can essentially live your life now without integrating into wider British society. You can go to heavily segregated schools, you can go to your neighborhood, you can go to the mosque, you can basically live in isolation from wider British society. The attitudes that we've seen in surveys regarding the events of October 7th, we've seen alarmingly large numbers of British Muslims denying the murder and rape of Jews on October 7th, which I found particularly uncomfortable. And we've seen very high levels of support and sympathy for Hamas. So we have a serious problem in the UK, which is feeding off two things. One is a continuation of the policy of mass immigration, which needs to stop. And the other has been the continued failure of our elites to integrate societies, to basically do what the Danes and now the Swedes have been trying to do, which is to be much more assertive and robust at integrating different communities into a shared national community. It's impossible to do that while running mass immigration, I would argue. I think where we're probably going to end up is needing some kind of break, like a 5-year break on migration, and trying to incentivize and essentially force some kind of assimilation and integration at the local level. Otherwise, we're going to end up with much higher rates of segregation. We're going to end up with lots more white flight, where white Brits are basically moving out of more diverse areas. And we're going to end up with this more sectarian politics, which is going to be much more organized along ethnic, racial, religious lines, which I don't think any of us want to see. But that will be the inevitable consequence of this, partly because, too, the rise of radical Islamism is feeding directly off the rise of the cultural left. And what I've argued is there is a toxic alliance between the two movements now. We have to be clear in our thinking. What is it that the radical cultural left and radical Islamists have in common? They're both illiberal. They both prioritize group identities over individual rights. They're both revolutionary. They want to overthrow Western societies and our ways of life. They're both suspicious, if not hostile, to objective scientific evidence and knowledge that undermines their core claims. They both use blasphemy codes to shut down dissenters. You're either a racist or you're Islamophobic. They're both religious movements. I mean, the woke left is a new religion, to quote John McWhorter, the professor at Columbia. And so they've got a lot in common. But because the woke left tend to dominate many of the institutions, the identity politics that they are embedding within the institutions, within our schools, within our universities, gives a free pass to radical Islamists because they're a minority. So essentially within the worldview of the woke left, which I would define as being really about the viewing all minority groups as sacred and morally superior to the majority, radical Islamists get a free pass, which is what we've seen every week in London on the protests against Israel and where we've seen open support for Hamas. Islamist terrorists have been given a free pass because the woke left allows that to happen. And that is what I'm concerned about. It is the interplay between the two. It's that toxic combination.
Now, I've now got to a point where every episode of the podcast I say that Hitchens quote that I've now forgotten, but the barbarians never take a city until someone holds the gates open for them.
Well, I think what is concerning is the extent to which I've passed through an institution where it's become very visible to me how strongly embedded the identity politics, or what Yasha Monk would call the identity trap, is now in our institutions. That it pervades everything. This binary worldview of minorities being sacred and the majority white group, including Jews, being morally inferior and so on. We don't need to rehash the identity politics stuff. But what worries me, firstly, the extent to which moderate liberals and centrists are going along with this and not calling it out, even though they know it's not defending the heart of liberal democracy, which is about pluralism, bargaining, compromise. The lack of organization among those who are trying to oppose it, and also the generational trend. So if you look at all of the major surveys that my friend Eric Kaufman, among others, have shown, the millennials and the Gen Z, the Zoomers who are coming up behind my generation, Gen X, are more fully invested in that ideology than Gen X and the baby boomers, much more fully invested in seeing the world through this very warped lens, backed up by the celebrity class and social media. So we have to, I think, hold people more to account at trying to get back to these shared stories about who we are, which aren't just about, our group identities. There has to be something else, and it has to be rooted in, a reassertion of who we are, and not being apologetic about who we are.
Do we need some levels of immigration? Does everyone need immigration?
Of course we do. Yeah, we need some immigration. I have no problem at all in saying we probably, in the UK, would need somewhere around maybe a net migration rate of somewhere around 50,000, maybe between 50 and 100K over the longer term, but it needs to be high skill. Ideally, migration from culturally compatible similar nations, and migration that is not only built around filling gaps in our economy, but is also built around strengthening the cultural and social fabric that makes us who we are. So that's where most voters are, by the way. Most voters are saying, look, my ideal level of migration is probably around 50,000 net migration. But as I say, in the short term, what we might need is actually just a break on migration of some description, because what we have at the moment is completely unsustainable.
Man, it does sound quite depressing, because I don't think you believe for a second that they are going to do something like that, the politicians.
No, I have come to the view that our politics is completely broken, and we're going to need some kind of new movement or vessel that is going to basically reassert the values and the values and the voice of ordinary people, that is going to be anchored in the principle of popular sovereignty, which is going to put, a bit like Brexit, the majority view against the elite minority. And on these issues like immigration, crime, embedding a principle of national preference into the economy, into housing, we see large majorities of people, 70, 80% are very supportive of all of those things. So I'm of the view that after 2024, we've got massive elections in Europe, the UK, the US. I think there has to now be a new generation of people who can actually come forward and say, look, this political consensus isn't working. The status quo isn't working. The political parties that were built in the time of the Industrial Revolution, they're no longer really working for a majority of people in the country. We're going to need something different. The question is, what is that thing? What does it look like, and who does it draw together? It needs to position itself as being above left and right, and it needs to speak very loudly for the forgotten majority. And if it does that, and it does it convincingly and in a credible way, it will be enormously successful, because I'm firmly of the view that the political zeitgeist that we currently have, big state, high tax, mass migration, low growth, pro-woke, is completely at odds with where the vast majority of people are. And we've seen that in places like Scotland. We've seen it in places like New Zealand, in Canada, in Australia. When a lot of these elite positions are put before the people, they are rejected en masse. So we need to create new political vehicles.
Why do we pander so much to the woke? Because it appears that they would lose any kind of election. They don't seem to make up any kind of majority. Why are they being pandered to?
I don't think that they're being pandered to. I think they have power. I think they have consolidated their power over the last 20, 30 years. I think, as we know from all of the surveys, the people that we would associate with the social justice left, the woke movement, whatever your preferred term, and I understand why people are dismissive of the word woke, but they are, undergraduate, postgraduate degree holders. They live in the big cities, the university towns. They come from privileged families. They've got a large degree of economic security. And they also disproportionately dominate the institutions. They tend to work in the universities, in the museums, in the galleries, in the BBC, in NPR, New York Times, etc., etc. And so they don't only wield power within the actual corridors of power, but they also wield an enormous amount of cultural power in the national conversation in terms of shaping the prevailing norms, rules, laws, values that they claim represent us. And actually, that conversation is not the conversation that the vast majority of people out there in the country want to have. But on multiple levels, they're wielding political, cultural, and economic power. So they are able to do many of the things that we've seen, in Scotland, where they push for children to be able to legally change their gender without any supervision, or in the UK, where the incoming likely Labour government is saying it's going to give away government contracts on the basis of race and ethnicity, or it's going to make it easier for children to change their gender, or in the US, where we've seen similar calls among Democrats and others to completely overhaul policing, which by all accounts has been a complete disaster in low-income, crime-ridden societies. And, I'm a pollster too, so whenever you put these positions out to the country, they're usually 15 to 20% positions, renaming pregnant women pregnant persons. I mean, that's like supported by 10% of people.
Yeah.
But as we saw in the UK with the CAS review of our National Health Service, what's happened is the elite expert class have gone so far in on things like gender ideology, where they're basically pushing kids down the medical transition pathway. They're not actually anchored in evidence anymore. And that's one of the most disturbing aspects of this for me, that when you look at the expert elite class and, they're all saying, well, why doesn't anybody trust the experts anymore? Well, if you look at things like the major government review, the CAS review, Dr. Hilary Cass, she looked at gender ideology in our healthcare services and basically said, look, a lot of the stuff that's happening here that's being promoted by the expert class just doesn't have anywhere near enough evidence to be happening. I mean, there's just insufficient evidence to be doing this stuff to kids. So I actually think, people have been justified in questioning the experts, because it isn't just about stuff like that review. It's, these disastrous foreign wars in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq. It's endless inequality. It's a global financial crash and not bothering to really punish anybody responsible for it. It's not regulating financial services. It's the constant elite failures for much of the last 20 years that I think have led people to look at all of these issues and think, well, hang on a minute. I'm not actually convinced the expert elite class does get things right. Maybe it is time for something different.